the actual 43-day-long coalition air war comprised of 4 very distinct elements.
The 4 phases of the coalition air campaign started with perhaps the most important, the gaining of air supremacy. The gaining of air supremacy allowed the Allies quite quickly to dominate the air flank, and therefore to be able to do with the air flank what they wished, to go on bombing raids, to transport airborne troops, to fly their helicopters, to resupply logistically for battlefield air interdiction and close air support, all the things that were going to follow. The second phase was the bombing of strategic targets, making it very difficult for the enemy to sustain violence against the coalition, hitting bridges, oil refineries, ammunition dumps, even nuclear power stations, rendering it very difficult for them to project their force.
The third phase became more important as the air war moved closer to the initiation of the ground offensive. This was the preparing the battlefield phase. This was the phase of attacking the Iraqi ground forces in the Kuwaiti theatre. Once the ground war started, the air war moved into its 4th phase, operations to support the ongoing ground offensive. This would involve close air support to the contact battle, and also air interdiction missions attacking enemy reserves and forces deep behind the front line.
During late January 1991, as the aerial devastation of Iraq continued, the relative quiet of the coalition's ground positions in northern Saudi Arabia was rudely shattered. From the 29th to the 31st of January, Iraqi forces launched a successful surprise attack on the Saudi border town of Al-Kafji. Simultaneously, American space satellites and J-STARS intelligence aircraft detected additional Iraqi tank columns moving south toward Al-Kafji to exploit the initial Iraqi success. Reacting quickly, coalition commanders employed tank-busting aircraft and assault helicopters, as well as ground firepower, to intercept and destroy these columns.
Finally, Saddam realized just how devastating coalition military strength was. Saddam had got to the point where he realized that there was nothing going to stop some form of ground offensive, and Tariq Aziz, the acceptable face of the regime, I suppose, makes it clear that Iraq is willing to unconditionally and immediately withdraw from Kuwait. But of course, it doesn't fit into American and Western requirements as it would enable Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait, retain his weapons of mass destruction, retain his armed forces intact, and to some extent play the part of the injured party to the Arab world.
I'm now going to show you.
As the relentless aerial strikes continued into mid-February, Bush rejected Saddam's proposed conditional withdrawal, and all thoughts turned to the now imminent ground war.
Through the crosshairs.
By now, the coalition believed its air campaign to have been so accurate that collateral civilian casualties had been minimized. Events like the bombing of the Amaria shelter on the 13th of February, where 200 civilians died, remained rare exceptions.
The air campaign was being sold to the media as a campaign in which civilians were not going to die, or at least they were not going to die unnecessarily. This was a high-technology campaign where missiles were going to be guided through windows. This was where cruise missiles could fly up main streets and hit a target with a precision which was undreamed of. Not 40 years earlier in the Second World War, but 10 years earlier. And unfortunately, sometimes it went wrong.
By now, the coalition air campaign had proved devastatingly effective. It had smashed Saddam's ability to control his forces, had destroyed his army's logistical infrastructure and maneuver capabilities, and devastated Iraq's industrial base. Yet Iraq's battered military machine did not collapse as Wharton had predicted. Indeed, it continued to function, albeit only after a fashion.
Although the coalition aerial assault did a lot of damage to Iraqi command and control, landlines managed to survive most of the attack. And it was relatively easy to put out new landlines, with the result that although Iraqi communications were compromised, they were never actually destroyed. And it's quite clear from the movement of Iraqi troops during the ground war, in particular the Iraqi attempt to block 7th Corps in southern Iraq, that Iraq retained its ability to communicate with its military formations.
Air power had not, after all, won the war by itself, and so the coalition readied itself for ground operations.
Once the air forces had weakened the enemy, made them deaf, dumb and blind, it was up to the ground forces then to go in and to wrap up the situation, to destroy them, to take them out of Kuwait City and bring the war to an end. But undoubtedly, the air campaign made that possible.
In the following weeks, the American 7th and 18th Corps secretly redeployed behind the US Marines in the east to assume new positions 200 miles farther west around Rafah. Schwarzkopf had switched the main effort of the coalition ground offensive way out west to outflank and envelop Saddam's frontier defense line. Schwarzkopf's final strategy for the ground war represented a well-orchestrated operational-level master plan. Each of its various elements dovetailed together to produce a synchronized effort that would swiftly deliver decisive success. The first element of the plan involved attacks by US Marines and Arab forces in the east, striking directly towards Kuwait City. Simultaneously, Marine amphibious forces would maintain the deception of an impending amphibious assault on the Kuwaiti coast.
In order to ensure that the Iraqi army held still for the operations that the coalition was going to conduct, they had to fix the Iraqi army in place. And the way that the coalition fixes the Iraqi army is by moving on Kuwait City. That focuses the Iraqis' attention on Kuwait. It ensures that they can't easily turn around to fight the coalition's more mobile armored forces in Iraq, because they are in the middle of fighting in and around Kuwait.
Once these attacks had started, the main coalition thrust would commence out in the west, beyond the main Iraqi defense line. While French forces would advance to screen the coalition's left flank, Lieutenant General Frank's 7th US Corps would swing east in a great left hook to crush the Iraqi forces in the Kuwaiti theater, particularly the Republican Guard, against the sea. Simultaneously, the 1st UK Armoured Division would advance to protect the inner flank of the 7th Corps' advance. On the northern or outer flank of Frank's advance, the 101st US Airborne Division was to initiate a series of air assaults deep into Iraq to establish forward operating bases astride Highway 8 along the Euphrates Valley, thus blocking Iraqi reinforcements attempting to reach the Kuwaiti theater.
The policy is get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And not an ounce of effort is expended in the Gulf War on anything else.
Some analysts have expressed surprise that the coalition didn't pursue their advance beyond the Euphrates River up towards Baghdad. The key reasons that the coalition stopped short of attacking Baghdad are mainly political. The mandate that they were pursuing, the UN resolutions, was to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. Whether that mandate actually allowed the coalition to operate on Iraqi territory at all was certainly subject to some debate.
Logistically, they had no chance of mounting a very swift attack once they'd driven through Kuwait into Iraq and towards Baghdad. They needed time to refit and reorganize themselves, by which time the Iraqis would have dug in, been perhaps much more passionate about defending their own ground, and a whole new Gulf War would have developed around that situation.
Schwarzkopf's ground war plan supposedly implemented the new American maneuverist doctrine of air-land battle. Introduced in the early 1980s, this doctrine